Did you know you have 3 holes down there? Like, actually, 3 holes. Not 2, 3. Today we're going to talk about anatomy. Welcome back to Tigress. You know, here we're all about talking about things that are usually very stigmatized in society, whether it be mental health, periods, sex, healing, unlearning, owning up to your fucking mistakes. And something that's been on my mind a lot because I've been making content about it every single day is anatomy. So yes, if you were assigned female at birth, meaning you have a uterus, you probably, like 100% have 3 holes down there: your urethra, your vaginal canal, and your anus. And these are things that I've been talking about a lot on social media because as I've posted about tampons and pads, because I'm in the business of making more sustainable versions of them, one of the most common questions I get from young menstruators is how to put in a tampon or where the tampon goes. And it's kind of this heartbreaking thing where I'm so glad that people feel comfortable to comment publicly and ask me these questions, but my heart breaks a little to realize that I am the person they go to as a stranger on the internet that they have never met and probably will never meet because they haven't had the opportunity to ask these questions in their families, at school, with their friends. And it's this thing that I think we really have to talk about. Like, why is it that we feel the need to apologize when we ask about questions to take care of our own period health? Why is it that we're afraid to use the words vagina, vulva, menstruation, period? Instead, we're stuck with these euphemisms like time of the month, or I feel like we all grew up with some sort of nickname for our private parts. We didn't say like my penis, my vagina. Like for me, I feel like I grew up with pee-pee, which is like, as a kid, is like a toddler as a kid. And I feel like pee-pee is like the closest you could get to it because it's where you're peeing. But I feel like I also grew up around so many other nicknames, like I think my sister called it Pikachu for a little bit, like, your Lulu, sometimes these like random female women names, your Woody, well, that's not a name for a penis, but you know what I mean. But like all these nicknames, because we're taught from a really early age that simply the label for our body parts is not something that can be talked about. Meanwhile, I would almost say that these body parts should be as open as talking about like your finger, your thumb, your toe, your knee. And in many ways, we should have even further open conversations about them because maintaining the health and hygiene of your genitalia areas takes a lot more care and consideration, right? And there's a lot more that we have to discuss because your genitalia is also looped in with sex, which is looped in with the overall conversation about consent. So, I don't think I've felt so deeply passionate about destigmatizing basic anatomy really until the last few months where, we've gained 10 to 15,000 followers a day on TikTok, which is really crazy and really exciting. And a lot of how I'm interacting with these followers is answering their questions about basic fucking anatomy. And I think that one of the things that I've started to really think about is like, what does the stigma look like in our society and what are the consequences of it, right? The stigma is that we feel like we can't talk about our period, so we have nicknames for our body parts. And then we have questions about it like, how do I put in a tampon? Or what is sex? Or what is this rash? Or what is discharge, right? I get a lot of questions of like, hey, there's like white worms coming out of me or like a white slug or goo. And it's like, yeah, that's vaginal discharge, right? Like there's so many different questions and unanswered questions out there. And I think that the result of having stigma like that is people don't feel comfortable asking questions about their basic body. They don't feel comfortable asking questions about what's happening in this area of their body that is so personal and private to them. And then they're suffering in silence, which is not okay either. The other aspect of this is what are the consequences when our healthcare system avoids talking about things like periods or, your genitalia as well, right? I recently wrote an article about menopause and this like fast growing industry of menopause. And one of the stats that we included in this article was that less than 20% of OBGYNs or doctors have had comprehensive education around menopause, right? And I feel like every menstruator has these horror stories in many ways of going to your doctor and asking about like how heavy your period should really be or how painful your cramp should really be, and us being kind of dismissed as, oh, well, having hormonal changes or having really painful periods is just cramps, right? So I feel like, again, stigma around not talking about these issues, not asking the right questions, not having a society that prioritizes comprehensive education even for the medical experts in the first place, or encouraging those pre-med students to talk about periods openly. Like, that is an issue that leads to individual suffering, but then also like overall societal, issues when even that care is not accessible in an equitable way and everything like that. So I feel like, big picture, stigma around not talking about anatomy is ridiculous. And I am genuinely so terrified and get so angry when I get messages, especially from pre-med students who are commenting like, excuse me, miss, I'm a pre-med student and I also think that talking about vaginas are gross. And it's like, maybe you should think about a different career. Like, this maybe just does not seem like the career for you. So yeah, I feel like this anatomy thing is something that like I also really feel like I'm doing all this learning about, and it makes me sad because I'm like, holy fuck, like my whole career has been periods. Like, literally, I've devoted my career to educating about periods, talking about periods, and yet a few months ago, I saw on a doctor's Instagram, actually, Dr. Chambers, who's like an influencer, but also an OBGYN, she posted this quiz on her Instagram stories that was like, most people don't know the difference between a vagina and a vulva, label which one it is, like A, B, C, or D, like a little Instagram poll. And I feel like I do know the answer in my head, but like when I was watching this Instagram story, even as someone who's so passionate about menstrual vaginal health, I was looking at this Instagram story and I kind of froze, and I was like, wait, do I know? Like, what is the difference between those, right? And then I started asking online, like, do y'all know what the difference between a vagina and a vulva is? Like, and the majority of people who are commenting, and of course, like, they all care, like my audience follows me oftentimes because they want to talk about puberty. Even they like refer to their whole genitalia as a vagina, when in reality, your overall like external part of your female anatomy is a vulva. And the vagina is literally the inside part, the inside vaginal canal. And not a lot of people know that, right? And so even when we do have the guts or, have rid the stigma from our own minds of being able to use the actual words, vagina or whatever, oftentimes, for the most part, we're using those terms incorrectly. And again, consequences of that being, are we really making progress in terms of how we can talk about this in an educated way that supports people having the care that they need? Okay, so then there's this other layer of it, which is I feel really strongly that as a cisgender woman, it is my responsibility to use my platform when I do talk about anatomy and, period care to be as inclusive with my language as I knowledgeably can. And I say knowledgeably because I feel like I'm always eager to learn more about how I can be more inclusive. Like, I will never say that I am the most inclusive, person to talk about gender or periods, because I'm not. And I feel like I inherently cannot be because I'm cisgender and I'm talking about my experience from what I learned, like from friends and on the internet. I mean, even like kind of a little bit of a tangent. A few days ago, my team was thinking about different ways that we can measure the demographics of our community with August. And we saw like a gender pronoun or an option to choose your gender as two-spirit, right? So like more indigenous layers of identifying with gender fluidity, right? So just as an example of, I think that there is a really nuanced and important discussion around how we talk about anatomy and bodies in the context of trying to fight for a more gender fluid world. And this is something that I think is my responsibility, because so much of our sex ed is one, either not talked about, two, not comprehensive, but also I think not respectful of the societal assumptions around gender, right? And what it means to have a penis and go through puberty, right? I feel like when you reach sex ed at age 13 or something, boys are taught like your voice is gonna lower and you're gonna be like a man now. You have to like be all macho, and it's like this toxic masculinity, like adventure, conquering, whatever, historically. And then girls on the other side are like, okay, you're gonna have pain and you're gonna be moody and you're gonna want to stay in bed, and maybe you should just like hush and rest, and you're gonna feel a little bit, like the history of gentleness when talking about women, and that's where period health and your health down there is very much like this flower of virginity to be like saved and whatever, right? So I feel like this other component of talking about anatomy, which is like talking about anatomy in the context of gender with the goal of being more fluid in our language, right? What I mean by this is I talk about being assigned female at birth, being assigned male at birth, or intersex, right? Which is something that I have a lot more learning to do about, and I will own up to that any day. But talking about that biology and what your body parts are, like separate from gender, right? Separate from that person identifies or that body identifies as a woman or a man, or non-binary, but really trying to be respectful of this separation between biology and gender, right? And I know it's a little bit confusing when I talk about this, for those of you who might not have been exposed to conversations around gender fluidity or how gender is a social construct. But I think that this is something we talk about a lot at August, right? Because we say August is made for anyone who menstruates, regardless of gender. If someone is assigned female at birth, meaning they have a uterus and they will menstruate and they need period products, whether they identify as a woman or a man or non-binary or whatever they choose to identify with, we want to be there for them and include them in the conversation about periods. We want to serve them with period products, and include them in the conversation about improving overall period care. For a lot of followers, like strangers online who have not been exposed to conversations like this, they see a lot of this language and they're like, wait, what? What the fuck? Like, only women get periods. Like, getting your period is a sign that you're a woman, right? And a lot of what we're trying to do is deconstruct that assumption and say, well, no, not really, because first of all, having blood come out isn't like equal to any sense of womanhood, and there are a lot of harmful things around that because it's linked to a deep history of thinking being a woman means being fertile and being able to have children, and like that is therefore your gender role, right? But also, having the biology does not influence how you would choose to identify based off of what you know personally about gender expression and gender identity. I think that there's another really, really crazy example, an angering example of where we have to talk about basic anatomy in the context of society, which is around virginity. I started talking about like what a hymen is online because I actually didn't know a lot about it, and it's one of the most common questions I get around like fear of using a tampon, which is, if I use a tampon, am I not going to be a virgin anymore? And this is, of course, coming from young menstruators, primarily people who identify as young girls, who I think already from a really early age, before they even feel comfortable saying the word period or vagina, are fearful of no longer being a virgin. And it's not always, from what I understand, because they feel scared of sex or intercourse, but they're scared of like the repercussions on their reputation, of what people think of them, of this concept of purity if they use a tampon and have something break their hymen. And I didn't know a lot about hymens in the first place. I actually had to do a lot of Googling myself before I started answering questions, and of course trying to point people in more comprehensive directions for learning. But for context, a hymen is just a layer of tissue that is on the opening of the vaginal canal. And it's not deep inside, it's literally on the opening. And it looks different for everybody. Some people have like several holes in it already. Some people have like an imperforate and need like a little surgery for it, which is a very minor thing. And even I actually got called in for using language like, will a tampon break the hymen? Because the more accurate word and verbiage for it, but also the more inclusive term is stretch, right? Like that you don't break it, because breaking is like has negative connotation of this is something you're breaking and then is broken, versus like, no, this is something that naturally has no biological need. Like the hymen serves absolutely no fucking purpose and looks different for everybody and is more stretching, right? I mean, a lot of people don't even know that they have a hymen in the first place. A lot of people don't know when they break it. Like, I feel like I never had a moment where I was like, oh, my hymen broke. And it was definitely not in like the first time I had sex or anything. It was just very much like, oh, I'm using a tampon and I definitely bled, but that could be my period blood. And some people break their hymens literally from like running or vigorous exercise or jumping, you know? And so I think that there's all these things to consider when we talk about like the basic anatomy of the hymen, right? What is it? Why is it there? No reason. And like, can it stretch, and how does it stretch, and where is it, right? And then there's this whole added layer again of society and what it has put on to people with hymens in kind of the assumptions of breaking or stretching or maintaining the hymen, right? I forget who it is. It was like some rapper. I think it was T.I. I think it was T.I. who got like canceled temporarily for talking about how he has his doctor check his daughter's hymen to make sure that she's a quote unquote virgin, right? Like this super problematic thing of like in pop culture and how it's talked about, or even like y'all probably have heard the term like pop a cherry, right? Like cherry pop or these things, like these are terms that are associated with like virginity, and virginity is, in my opinion, a like heteronormative social construct. And I'm not saying that like I never use the term virgin, right? Like I definitely grew up thinking I'm a virgin, I'm not a virgin. But I think that it's only been in the last couple years of being so immersed in conversations around like feminist theory and doing a lot of my own like academic understanding. I was minored at Harvard, we call it secondary. I minored in women's and gender studies, and like learning about virginity there is like, wait, yeah, you're right. Like, what does virginity actually mean, right? Does it mean intercourse? So does that mean, are you a virgin if it's like girl on girl sex, right? Like I would consider that sex, but then, do you only have one definition of what sex is? Are you a virgin if you are, if it's oral sex, right? Like there's all these different layers that at the end of the day have no right or wrong answer. It's like a societal construct, right? It's like society telling us that if we have something penetrate, usually a penis because it's heteronormative conversation, that we are no longer a virgin. And then there's this added layer of like, well, then what are the consequences of not being a virgin, right? I think Jane the Virgin, by the way, like truly one of my favorite TV shows of all time, Jane the Virgin, which you can watch on Netflix. The whole premise is around being taught as like a young Catholic girl that losing your virginity is like having a flower, and it's this beautiful flower, and when you crush it, or you rip it to shreds, which is them losing their virginity, you can never bring that flower back to life. And so you have to protect it, and it's your purity, right? And, this historically, and still today, by the way, has such harmful consequences. First of all, like there is no sort of like purity in and of itself is like this, it just makes me cringe. But it's victim shaming, slut shaming. At the basis of it, I think is a lot of foundational understanding of virginity, right? As a survivor of sexual assault, I have always been so fearful, and like I'm still trying to rid myself of that fear of like potential significant others or sexual partners will think that I'm broken, that I'm dirty, that I'm less attractive because I've been assaulted. But I think similarly, when when you first start dating, and I've had ex-boyfriends do this, I've also seen this happen to like people like my best friends or sisters even, like them being shamed by a partner that they're dating for having a higher body count than them, right? Like having had sex with more people, or, if one partner's a virgin and the other's not, like the feeling of like literal disgust if someone else has had sex, right? Like all these things that I think are shaming, and oftentimes shaming women more than men, obviously. And I think at the same time, like, virginity is instilling fear not only about sex, but like in some countries where, arranged marriage or things like that, like virginity is a factor of purity that is being taken into account in terms of valuing the potential of that bride, right? So it's like there's so many different things to analyze when we talk about virginity and how we contextualize virginity. And I think for me, like I'm seeing it most in young people having a fear of using tampons, right? And tampons are like amazing. They're needed. Like when you don't want to wear something and feel a pad rubbing up on you, you should want to wear tampons. And like we should talk about this. So I also started thinking a lot about like over the last couple weeks of making a lot more content around anatomy and sex ed, I've been thinking a lot more about like how I was taught sex ed in school. I feel like it was barely talked about comprehensively. Now that I know more about periods and period pain and endometriosis and uterine fibroids and discharge, like what I learned in sex ed, like I wouldn't even consider sex ed. It was like splitting boys and girls up into different classrooms, again, gender binary, and then basically telling the girls like the basics of here's a tampon and a pad and ask your parents for it, right? And I think that at the same time, when we learned about STDs and birth control and condoms, even in a progressive city like, Portland, it was very much in the fear-induced, like, be scared of STDs and, oh, yeah, everyone or if you sleep with someone, you're sleeping with everyone that they've slept with, right? I feel like that's a really common thing that we're taught in sex ed, which is, making people feel terrified of sleeping with people because you might catch an STI because you don't know who they've slept with, right? And what does that teaching do, right? I'm not saying that STIs are not important to learn about, but what this is teaching young people and like teaching people who go through this sort of narrative is I am approaching sex and intercourse, but also treatment of my own genitalia with skepticism, fear of another person, not trusting them, not trusting my own instincts, not wanting to talk about it, and this fear of STIs that makes it so that there's shame perpetuated around having an STI, right? Around being able to diagnose your own STI, right? I have friends who have genital herpes or otherwise, and seeing how much shame that they have in their own hearts, like, makes me want to cry because it's like, it's so hard. And as much as I feel like I, as a friend, can be like, this is something that should be normalized, that you should feel no fear over, you see that there's just this internal debate of they've been so conditioned to have shame about something that they had no control over, and it's changed the relationship that they had with their genitalia. And look, it's not on them to have to blame for contracting an STI. If anything, it's on potential past partner that didn't disclose it, which is usually the case. But again, I feel like when we talk about why it's important to destigmatize anatomy and have sex ed, a lot of it is because as a society, but also on an individual level, it's absolutely unacceptable that we have so many people suffering in silence because we can't have basic conversations about our body parts. Like, young people should not be confused about the fact that pee and period blood come out of different holes, right? By the way, if you don't know, pee comes out of the urethra, period blood comes out of your vagina. Like, I say that over and over again, and it's ridiculous how many times I say that. Anyway, so just to wrap up, like, I basically just wanted to come on and rant about this because I've been thinking about it constantly. Like, I have all my own learning to continue doing, like, even about the intersex experience. Like, I feel like that is a chapter of my own learning that I have barely scraped the surface of, and I want to learn more about so that I can be further and further inclusive about these conversations. And again, when talking about anatomy, we have to talk about it in the context of society. And I think society is like a chicken and an egg situation where, like, society and the consequences of having virginity as a social construct, inducing so much fear and shame into young people and people today, like, that is a problem. And we need to fix that. And I think it starts by having open conversations about anatomy. So how do we do that? I think we keep talking about anatomy, and when people have questions about it, we talk about it, and we have open conversations about it, and we tune in to, like, obviously I'm biased, content like mine, where it's like, yeah, let's talk about anatomy and not use nicknames. And for young parents out there, when you're, like, talking to a young kid, don't shame it as potty talk. Like, if they talk about their body part, treat it like they're talking about a bruise on their elbow, right? Like, talk about it with the scientific terms. And yeah, I mean, I think that's all I have to say on that. And clearly I get heated about this, but tune in on Tigress to talk about anatomy and vaginas and penises, and tune in on TikTok where I'm making lots of anatomy content every single day. Anyways, that's it for today. Back again next Wednesday with another episode of Tigress. Let me know what you want to talk about. A lot of the topics I talk about on this podcast are because, like, I got a message or saw a comment being like, hey, I want you to dive deeper into this or something like that. So again, I want to hear from y'all. let me know. Follow DCP on social media as well. They're my incredible production company. There's a lot of thought that went into choosing them as the production company. We saw a lot of offers, and we really chose them because they are an incredible mission and values aligned production company that exists to amplify underrepresented voices. I'm super proud to be a part of their roster of podcasts. Huge thank you to my Tigress team, all the incredible producers, and the DCP team for putting this together. And I will talk to you next week. Bye, y'all.